Hello, my name is Corrine Everett, and I'm an associate here at the Crookston Public Library, part of Lake Agassiz Regional Library. And we are here with Anders Morley to talk about his book, This Land of Snow, in which he talks about spending the 4 coldest months of the year traveling on skis across the half-wild country of northwestern Canada. This Land of Snow was recently honored in the 2021 National Outdoor Book Award, recently honored with the 2021 National Outdoor Book Award in the Journeys category. And the book is available in our collection at Lake Agassiz Regional Library, and the audiobook is on Hoopla. So if you haven't read it, I encourage you to check it out. And I'll turn it over to Anders. Thank you, Anders.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's great to be talking to a Minnesota crowd. I think you'll appreciate, or if you've already read it, that you might appreciate my book more than other people, because you can feel some of the reality of the cold. Sounds like it's been very cold there lately. I had forgotten that your library system is called the Lake Agassiz library system. Louis Agassiz, for whom Lake Agassiz is named, used to take his holidays in Bethlehem, New Hampshire, in the town next to where I live, and we have a Mount Agassiz as well. So no, there's a connection. So yes, as Corrine mentioned, I'm here to talk about my book, This Land of Snow, A Journey Across the Northern Winter, which some of you know, it sounds like, is, at its most basic level, it's a story of an entire winter spent skiing across a pretty large space. But I wanted it to be more than just an adventure tale. I wanted it to be something that might interest people who are not necessarily cross-country skiers themselves. So I hope that there are other elements to the story that might appeal to just to armchair adventurers, let's say. And I also wanted to tell a story that was that somehow was set against the backdrop of events in my own life, because it felt like the journey that I'm describing was that it had some kind of a significance that went beyond just itself, and it was kind of a turning point. So those are all themes that are in the book. So what I'd like to do this evening is start by talking about the background, how and why it occurred to me to do something like this in the first place. And I'm going to just jump right over to screen share and start sharing some pictures. And then from there, I'm going to kind of take you along the trail with me, and I'll stop at 2 or 3 points and read a little bit from the book. And then after that, I'll open up and we'll have some conversation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So let me just jump over to screen share. And here we go. Slideshow mode. All right. Can someone just give me a quick thumbs up to if it's on full screen? Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So when I sat down to write a book about this journey, like I said, I didn't want to just start the moment my skis hit the ground, because I was interested in the context and more than just the adventure. And so one of the first questions I had to address is, where am I going to start my story? And I came up with a few different answers, and I talk a bit about my childhood and other things. But one of the stories I tell that's meant to kind of frame my own story is the story of the guy you see on your screen right now, whose name is Tony Matt. Tony Matt was an Austrian. He was a well-known Austrian ski racer in the 1930s. But in 1938, when the Germans annexed Austria, he had an opportunity to leave the country, and he left with a few other Austrian skiers, the most famous of whom was known as Hannes Schneider, who was a well-known ski instructor at the time and an exponent of alpine skiing technique. And so all these Austrians came over sort of en masse to the US, and they all ended up in a town called North Conway, which is in central New Hampshire in the White Mountains, and it's kind of a major ski center in the Northeast. And when they got there, they founded what is, I believe, or what was, I believe, the first alpine ski school in the United States. But Hannes Schneider, this guy, is best remembered today for his role in a ski race in 1939, which was called the American Inferno. The American Inferno was run down the slopes of, of Mount Washington, which is the highest mountain in the Northeast, and it's in New Hampshire. So the course went from the summit of the mountain down to the base, and it's about a 4-mile run. And the route went down what's called the summit cone, and then it dropped into that kind of bowl you see in the middle of the picture, which is known as Tuckerman Ravine. And then from there, the last 2 miles were down through the woods to the bottom of the valley. Now, Tony Matt won the race the first time he ran it. And it was, as far as I'm aware, the first time that he'd ever skied on Mount Washington. And that is probably part of the reason why he won the race. So he wasn't really familiar with the terrain. And his plan was, before going over the nearly vertical head wall of the ravine, to do a couple of quick turns to kind of slow himself down. But he miscalculated and didn't get any turns in it, ended up just having to shoot down the ravine. And then kind of was never really able to slow down until he got to the bottom of the mountain. Now, this is a story that my dad loved to tell when I was a kid, and I would do a lot of hiking around Mount Washington with my dad and my brothers. And we did a lot of downhill skiing at a mountain just across the valley that had basically this view of the mountain. And in my dad's telling of the story, Tony Matt tore down out of Tuckerman Ravine and shot down this trail to the bottom of the mountain. And when he got there, he was so terrified, so shaken up, because he could have basically killed himself. He managed to get down the mountain in 6.5 minutes, which was less than half the time of the existing record. And experts who have looked at film footage of his descent of Tuckerman Ravine have estimated that he hit about 90 miles an hour. So if you've ever seen what skis looked like in 1939, basically just wooden planks with a cable that went around your heel. And then you begin to understand why he was so shaken up when he got to the bottom of the mountain. And so my dad would say he basically just kind of ignored the crowds, took his skis off and walked over to his car and backed over them and broke them in half, and then drove off and never skied again. And it was a memorable story, one that I heard a lot as a kid. And I thought, yeah, there's something I like about that story. And I think something that's fitting, that would make this story a good one with which to frame my own story. The idea being that sometimes it's possible to take our passions a bit too far, because that's certainly an idea that's present in my book. I started skiing, downhill skiing first when I was 5 years old. And then it was another 5 years or so before I discovered cross-country skiing. And that happened when I kind of found, by chance, I guess you might say, a pair of old wooden skis in my parents' basement. And they had once belonged to my mother, whom I'd never seen on skis before. And so I kind of dug them out of the basement and then found some boots that went with them. And at that point, my shoe size was about the same as my mother's. So I was able to fit into these boots, and I clipped into the skis and just went off into the woods near my home in New Hampshire, which has, nice snowy winters and lots. It's kind of like Minnesota with hills, not quite as cold, it sounds like. I think we only hit -18 the other day. So anyway, that's kind of how my experience of cross-country skiing has been ever since, just kind of a way of getting around in the woods in the wintertime. I've skied now and then at Nordic centers, but really I just kind of prefer to go off into the woods and ski around like that. Now, we're going to have to fast forward here if we're going to get this story really rolling. About 20 years after that last picture, while I was in graduate school, I needed to learn German pretty quickly. And so what I decided to do was just to head to Germany for a semester and do an intensive language course. while I was there, I met a young woman who was in the same course as me, but she had come from Italy to study German. And to make a long story short, we started dating and became a couple. And a couple of years later, I moved to Italy, to a town called Bergamo, or a city, I should say, small city, which is right at the foot of the Alps. And Ellen and I eventually got married, and I was, living happily and working in Bergamo. But after 7 or 8 years there, I started to feel very uneasy, first in a generalized kind of way, and I wasn't really sure what was going on. I knew that homesickness was part of it. I had never thought I'd be living in a place like Italy or in a city. So I felt homesickness. I missed kind of the open spaces and the low population density of northern New England. I missed winter, but there were other things too. I wasn't terribly happy with my job. Just the shape of my life wasn't really what I had kind of expected it to be, say 10 years earlier. So I didn't really see a way out of this crisis. And it was while I was in the midst of it that I one day, quite by chance, picked up a copy of a National Geographic magazine one day while just walking past a newsstand. And when I got it home, I opened it up, and this is the picture that was before me. Before I even read the article, something about the picture just kind of leapt out at me and seemed to be saying, this is what you need to be doing. So I mentioned that I'd done a lot of cross-country skiing. It was something I still did. I did a fair amount of backcountry skiing in the Alps. But I had also for a long time wanted to go on a very long self-propelled journey, like a months-long continental scale kind of journey. And I wasn't sure what it would be, but I kind of thought it would be something like the Appalachian Trail or Pacific Crest Trail, something like that, in the summertime. But suddenly it occurred to me that I could put these two things together: my love of cross-country skiing and winter, and this dream of going on a long journey, and I could make a long journey in the wintertime. And before long, I started thinking in terms of Canada. I happen to be a dual citizen of Canada and the US. My father is Canadian. And so I knew that I could spend as much time as I wanted to in Canada without having to worry about applying for immigration status or anything like that. And I started fantasizing, I guess you might say, a lot about this journey. And as I did so, it became more and more concrete in my mind. I started thinking about practical logistic problems, almost as a kind of a game at first. What route would I take? Would I travel from east to west or west to east? What kinds of equipment would I use? Things like that. And this went on for months. And I started spending more time in the Alps exploring. And I started to think of that exploring in terms of training and thinking about systems that I would use if I were going to be out for months at a time. And I also did a lot of reading about other people who had explored on skis. One of the best known of whom was Fridtjof Nansen, who you see on your screen now. Nansen had been kind of a hero of mine in my early 20s. He was, of course, a Norwegian explorer. Most of his exploring was done in the late 19th century. He was the first to cross the Greenland ice cap, and then later attempted to reach the North Pole. He didn't quite make it, but he got closer than anyone had before him. But one of the things that I especially loved about Nansen was that he seemed to have, at least I thought, a kind of a similar attitude as I did towards cross-country skiing, which is, of course, the only kind of skiing that he knew about. And that was that really basically cross-country skiing was kind of a literal term. It was meant for skiing across country, across huge sections of the landscape. And so he kind of became, I guess, kind of a guiding light as I thought about this journey. Now, the problem was that this was going on for months, and I had never mentioned it to Elena, who, as I mentioned at this point, was my wife. And when I did mention it to her one day in the fall of 2011, it sounded to her like I was announcing that I was going to be doing this, not like I was submitting it as a topic of conversation. And in retrospect, that probably I was quite excited about it, and that probably is how it came across, and that also was probably my intention. But needless to say, this did not go over very well, and it didn't help that she had no ability to understand or appreciate why I would want to do something like this. She's not a winter lover. She likes the outdoors, but not in a kind of the same immersive kind of way that I do. And so that didn't help things. And really, my proposed expedition very quickly became kind of a wedge that seemed to kind of drive itself deeper and deeper between the two of us. And my marriage seemed to enter this downward spiral for months. But nevertheless, I'm kind of a stubborn person. And 14 months later, here I was in Vancouver with this pile of stuff ready to head north. And at this point, I had all but decided that I wasn't going to be going back to Italy, that this expedition would mean the end of my marriage, and I thought it was worth it. And so there is in the book kind of this story of this apparently disintegrating marriage, and it's a story that goes along with the main story of the journey itself. Of course, it doesn't occupy as many pages because it's probably not as interesting for readers. But it is there, although I'm not going to talk about it much this evening. I will return to it at the end of my talk. So from Vancouver, I took a series of boats up the coast, up what's known as the Inside Passage, the channel that runs up through the islands off the British Columbia coast, and then eventually up into the islands of Southeast Alaska as well. But I was headed for a town called Prince Rupert, which is Canada's northernmost Pacific port. And so what that means is that it's just a few miles shy of the Alaska Panhandle. Prince Rupert claims to be the rainiest town on Earth. But as I came into town, the sun, I mean, relatively speaking, the sun had come out, which to me seemed like a good omen. Now, from Prince Rupert, where there was no snow, and I hadn't expected to find snow, like many places on the northwest coast, they don't really get a very hard winter. So from there, what I did was shipped a few of my things via Greyhound. I just freighted them east to the next town to the east, which is called Terrace, and it's about 90 miles inland. And I hoped that by that time I would be into some wintry weather. It was mid-November at this point. And so after I freighted my sled and skis and a few other things ahead, I started walking east. And when I got to the town of Terrace, I found that it had started to snow. The first blizzard of the year came into town just as I did. And it snowed about 1.5 feet over the course of a couple of days. But I also realized that I was carrying more than I wanted to be carrying, a lot more than I wanted or thought I needed to be carrying. And so I checked into a motel and spent a couple of days kind of weeding through my kit and getting rid of stuff and resting up too, because I had kind of developed what was probably some kind of tendonitis in my knee. My knee had really swollen up during the walk under a very heavy load. But eventually I was ready to go again. And what I did was I had this heavy load, and it was very, very hard to move if I wasn't on skis. And so I was in the middle of this town, and it was like many northern towns, there aren't very many of them, and so they tend to be kind of commercial hubs. So even though it was a tiny little town, there was a lot of sprawl on the outside of it. And so basically, to kind of get through the belt of sprawl, I called a taxi to take me out to this where a river called the Copper River flowed into the main river in that area, which is called the Skeena River, I'm sorry. And my plan was then to head into the mountains and cross a pass, which I'll describe in a minute. But I want to stop at this point and read a little bit about the first moment of my taking this taxi ride out to the valley, and then the moment my skis hit the snow. Wet snow was falling when I called a taxi to take me out of town. The driver had bleach blonde hair and a bowl cut. He must have been my age, but looked like he'd walked off the page of a surfing magazine from circa 1986. As I filled his cab with my unwieldy traveling equipment, he stood by in his summer weight duds, shoulders hunched in that irrational reflex to precipitation, and watched. He was friendly enough, more than happy to talk as we rolled out of town. Despite having lived in Terrace all his life, he knew almost nothing of the terrain beyond its downtown. The Copper River, my destination, 10 minutes up the highway, rang only the most muffled of bells, and that's if he wasn't bluffing. It took patience to convey to him what I was up to. He had trouble wrapping his mind around some aspect of the journey. The idea of skiing tripped him up. No, 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 I seem to remember lecturing as wet snow splatted against the windshield, not behind a motorboat, the kind where you slide over the snow. But he also stumbled on the geography involved. You're right, I conceded. The road does go to Smithers, but the distance is shorter over the mountains where the road can't go. Did I see a gun in your stuff? He asked at one point. Yes, you did, I said. Cool, what's that for? Grizzlies, maybe? No way, grizzly bears? I hope they're sleeping now, but these mountains are full of them. He stopped to think. Seriously? Crazy. I guess they would be, wouldn't they? I never thought of that. I saw where a logging road went into the bush, just south of where the Copper River met the Skeena. Do you mind pulling in here, I asked. No problem, he said. He drove in 50 yards to a place wide enough to turn around in and stopped. Here we are, I said. I paid the fare and we both got out. As he watched me unload my equipment, he said, hey, this is like a movie or something. I mean, like, I might be the last guy that ever sees you. Thanks, buddy. Oh, sorry, but just in case, what's your name? Anders Morley. Andrew Swirly? No, A-N-D, I mean, yes, Andrew Swirly is fine. I thanked him for the ride and took down his number in case I ever needed a lift back to Terrace. When the cab driver was gone, the exhaust from his car had dissipated, to be replaced only by the steam of my breath. It was deathly quiet. The snow settled down so inaudibly it was deafening. I looked at my gear strewn on the white ground. I looked at the wall of forest and the mountains behind mountains and mountains beyond that, all of it white. I sensed in my bones that there was a continent beyond those mountains, clenched in frost and covered over with crystals of snow that would sting. What am I doing? I don't want to do this, I said into the silence. Do you realize what you're getting yourself into? I was suddenly aware that I had not considered this particular question before, that I really never really until now could have. I had a towering premonition of the discomfort and pain that I knew must be my almost constant company for months to come. But then I felt cold. I learned very quickly that living outside in the wintertime leaves no time for standing around thinking. Movement is the creed of the northern winter, and until movement generates fire, it must be ceaseless. So I briskly set about assembling the hauling system for my sled and loaded my food and camping equipment. I'd never pulled the sled before, I would have been embarrassed to admit. I decided to try first without using skins for traction. I rubbed grip wax into my skis, slid into my harness and pulled, but nothing happened. I thought of Buck, the invincible sled dog in the Jack London story, and tried again, but the suggestion did nothing to make my sled budge. There was no precedent for this in my skiing experience. All right, so eventually I did manage to get going. And as I mentioned, my first objective was to get across this section of mountain. And these mountains there are two ranges really that go up and down British Columbia, the Coast Mountains in the west and in the Rockies in the eastern half of the province. And the Coast Mountains are just the Canadian name of what are called the Cascades in the US. And this part of the northern section of the Coast Mountains is called the Kitimat Range. And so I was going to be crossing this section from the town of Terrace to a little village called Telqua, and it was about 100 miles between them. And so basically I had to ski up this valley and then climb up to a pass and then ski down the opposite side out another valley. So it was still early winter at this point. There's a lot of moisture in the air and the snow was wet and sticky, but by day it was still pretty warm. It would be above freezing, I think. Often you can see from this picture that I'm not wearing a lot of clothing. For the first 20 miles or so, there was a snowmobile track that I was able to follow, which made the going much easier. I didn't have to break trail, but soon I had to start breaking trail and climbing. In about 3 days in, this is what it looked like. This is a view back towards the Pacific. And you can see that it was like going up kind of a long staircase. I would have to climb for a bit, and then it would even out a bit, and then I'd climb, and then it would even out. Now this next picture is here as kind of a parenthesis for anyone in the audience who's not a cross-country skier or a backcountry skier, because a lot of people don't know that it's possible to ski uphill, and so they may be asking themselves how I'm skiing uphill, but it is possible. And it's possible thanks to what are called climbing skins. They're called skins because they were once made of seal skins, although now they're synthetic. And basically they're like these little pieces of fabric that stick to the bottom of your skis. And the fabric has this diagonal nap to it. And so the diagonal is backward facing. And so what that does is enables you to slide forward, but if there's any downward or backward pressure put on your skis, the fabric bites into the snow and keeps you from sliding backwards. And so you can go up pretty steep slopes. And I had two types of climbing skins. I had these shorter ones that you see on my skis here, which gave me enough traction to pull the sled and to go up slight inclines. And then I had longer ones that go from the tip of the ski all the way to the tail, and those give you a lot more climbing power. And so thanks to my climbing skins, soon I was up in the middle of the mountains, approaching this pass. And so there was kind of a row of peaks on my right hand or south side, and then a mirror image of these ones on the north side. And the valley was getting higher and higher and narrower and narrower as it reached towards the pass. And I found myself soon having to ski up onto these fairly steep slopes on the sides of the valley. And there was a lot of snow. And this combination of things spells avalanche danger, which was not something I was really prepared to deal with since I was alone. And I also had this huge anchor tied to my waist, my sled. So if I were caught in an avalanche, it seemed like my chances of survival were pretty slim. So I was very anxious to get through this, get beyond the pass and down the other side. And just as my anxiety was kind of creeping up, I heard this bang 600 or 700 yards ahead of me. Excuse me. And the whole side of this mountain came sliding down, and snow billowed into the air hundreds of feet. And of course, I stopped immediately. And I eventually dug out my camera and took a picture, but you can see even a few minutes later, the snow still hasn't settled all the way back to the ground. This was the first big scare of the winter. And it was particularly scary because it was very close to dark at this point. And there was this long kind of slope like this that went along for a couple of miles. And on my left-hand side was this lake, but again, it was early winter, and there was snow on the lake, so I wasn't sure how strong the ice was, and didn't really want to risk skiing too far out and sleeping on it. And so I knew I was going to have to sleep somewhere near the base of this long slope, and I had no idea how stable it was. So it wasn't a very good night's sleep, but I did survive, and eventually got down the other side of the pass. And kept skiing onwards toward the east. Now this picture is here for, it's not a great picture, but it's here for anyone who happens to be interested in winter camping and the equipment I was using. My sleeping bag was, of course, arguably the most important piece of equipment I had along. Now this picture was taken in a little unfinished cabin that I spent one night in central British Columbia, which seemed like better shelter than my tent. But my sleeping bag, to get back to that, is it was a down bag, and it's got a twin top, which is an unusual feature. And the two tops had different thicknesses, and so you could use them either one separate, either one on its own, or the two together, and get sort of 3 different temperature ranges. And another feature that I particularly liked was that it had a zip that went nearly all the way around the sleeping bag. And so what that meant is I could ventilate it in all kinds of ways, which is useful for regulating your temperature, which is very important when you're using a tent night after night for a very long time in the cold to keep the condensation to a minimum. And I could go on about the sleeping bag, but I won't, because I know for a lot of people it's not the most interesting subject. Now, about 3 weeks into the journey, somewhere as I was getting towards central British Columbia, it became apparent to me that there was no way that I was going to be able to ski all the way across Canada in one winter at the rate I was going. And so at that point, my focus shifted to skiing across the season, just getting all the way through winter. So skiing until, mid-March, late March. But what you see on your screen now is a map of the journey I actually made. And so the route, for the most part, corresponds to what would have been the first 40 or 50% of the journey that I had originally intended to make. And the idea was kind of to straddle the 55th parallel, more or less. So you can see that line going across the map. It's marked with 55 degrees. And the idea there was that latitude basically corresponds to kind of the heart of the boreal forest, which is the ecosystem in which skiing originally emerged in the old world. And so I kind of like the idea of skiing across a landscape that in some way fit with skis. Now, people have asked me whether there was a trail I was following or a specific route to get across this part of Canada. And the answer is no, there isn't. I had to piece together my own sort of patchwork. And what that meant was sometimes using ordinary trails, the kinds of trails that people hike on in the summertime. And so, for example, to get across that first mountain range I described, I was just following an ordinary trail. In other places, I relied on snowmobile trails, especially in Manitoba, but also a little bit here and there in other places. In British Columbia, I used a lot of logging roads. There are thousands of miles of logging roads all over the province. And basically, they're just, single lane gravel tracks cut through the woods that go into very remote areas. And most of them are not cleared in a given winter because they only bother clearing roads where they're actually actively taking timber out in a winter. And so most of them just lie under a few feet of snow and are perfect for anyone who wants to travel long distances over the snow, whether snowmobilers or skiers in my case. Not that I saw any other people doing these things, but I mean, if they wanted to, they could have. And then when I got into Alberta, I used a lot of railroad tracks, which is another thing that a lot of people don't think of, especially in the Northeast. When you talk about railroad tracks, people tend to think of Amtrak and commuter rails going to Boston or New York or Washington. But here there are railroads in places where there are no ordinary roads, that are basically just cargo lines that connect one town to another town. And if it's just wilderness in between those towns, that's the straightest line, and that's the line the train follows. Now in this picture, I'm coming into a rail yard in a town, so there's a bit of human busyness, but most of the time it was more like this. And there would be tens or hundreds of miles of railroad, just like this line through the forest with no signs of human presence, except for the fact that the trees were cut and that there are these two pieces of steel. And of course, if it snowed, even the two pieces of steel would disappear. Now on a line like this, a train would come by at most once a day, but sometimes not for 2 or 3 days at a time. So in Alberta, I skied, I would guess probably 200 or 300 miles along the railroad. And then once I got into Saskatchewan and Manitoba, of course, like in your neck of the woods, but perhaps even more so, there are just lakes everywhere, and all of them frozen, of course. And so those become great ski trails. Now, with all this thinking about how I was getting, kind of practical thinking about how I was going to be getting across the landscape, I would sometimes find myself thinking poetically or philosophically about how we as a species move across the landscape. And then occasionally I would see other animals and kind of admire how much more gracefully they moved across the landscape. And that's the spirit of this picture of this mouse track. I just loved the line of it. And what I especially like is how you can see that the line that mouse's tail has made as it drags along behind its footprints. But at this point, I think I want to read a little passage about trails, since it's one of the themes that I've returned to now and then in the book. I had begun to learn on my journey that I too needed some kind of a trail in the snow to cover any great distance on my skis without my heavy load behind me. This much should have come as no surprise, for I've been a user of trails all my life. The mythical ideal of self-sufficiency that had grown in my consciousness during my years in Europe in reaction to a sense of claustrophobia began not only to fade, but to look downright dangerous. I started to realize that there was only a short step between the idealization of independence and misanthropy. But I still believed in the value of simplicity and lightness. Perhaps one of the virtues underlying a simple kind of infrastructure, like a trail, is its impermanence, or rather its ability to impinge on the physical universe only when it is needed, and then to fade into a near invisibility. These are really two separate things. In one sense, a trail has a lightness to it, such that if it is not used for a time, it will grow over or be snowed in the case of some winter trails, and be swallowed up by the landscape. In the other sense, even when a trail is still used regularly, in the intervals between uses, whether those intervals last hours or days or weeks, it has a way of blending into the background so that life around it can go on without distraction. But so many of our infrastructures, when they're unused and eventually abandoned, persist as scars that clutter the landscape and perhaps, by their presence in our mindscape, detract from our ability to think in closer harmony with our natural environment. It is precisely its ability to promote such harmony that may be another motivating virtue of an infrastructure like a trail. Portage trails foster harmony insofar as they respond to the locomotive needs of the land's inhabitants by bringing out the potential of the lakes to act as passageways without bringing harm to the lakes themselves. There is also harmony that arises out of the creation and use of a winter trail, whether it is traveled over on snowshoes, skis, dog sleds, or even a snowmobile. Rather than move snow out of the way like some nuisance, as we do when we plow roads, the traveler on a winter trail adapts to float on top of it and, in the case of skis, even takes advantage of snow's slipperiness to move faster. In a sense, the migratory paths of birds, whales, and caribou are a kind of natural, built-in infrastructure. The same might be said of the Earth's valleys, mountain passes, rivers, and chains of lakes. The only technology, or better technique, required to make them usable is the ingenuity of the user, whose virtues are transience, mobility, flexibility, and the fact that the mind needs no storage space. Perhaps grace, a species of intelligence, is the ability to recognize the most appropriate way of moving or not moving in any set of circumstances, paired with the skill requisite to act accordingly. Now, just before leaving British Columbia, I crossed the Peace River, and it was kind of it was the most important river that I crossed over the course of the whole winter, and it was kind of an exciting moment because the Peace is a north-flowing river, and via the Slave and Mackenzie rivers, it eventually spills into the Arctic Ocean. So that was, yeah, that was exciting for me, given the sort of northern theme of the journey. Now, interestingly, the river was actually flowing. You wouldn't expect it to be. Was in probably the northernmost point of my journey, around near Fort St. John in British Columbia, where it's very, very cold. But there's a dam just upstream of Fort St. John, and it's constantly modulating the level of the river, and so it never has time to freeze. And then I crossed into Alberta, and the thing about Alberta was that the prairie pushes farther north there than it does in its neighboring provinces. And so occasionally I would find myself having to ski down out of the bush and onto this open northern prairie for a couple of days at a time. And it was January, and it was very windy, as you would expect, being exposed that way. And so some of the coldest moments of the winter were spent here in Alberta. Now, in north central Alberta, I came to the first of 3 really big lakes that I skied either along or across. Over the course of the whole winter, as I mentioned before, I skied across a lot of lakes, but this was the first big one. It's called Lesser Slave Lake. And this is what my camp looked like, along the side of a lake. I used a tunnel-shaped tent, which tends to be more wind-resistant than certain other kinds of tents, which seemed to me like it would be useful, and in fact it was. And the tent is divided into 2 compartments, and I would sleep in the compartment that's farther away from us in this picture. And then the nearer part is called the vestibule, and that's where I would store anything that needed to be kept inside. And that's also where I did my cooking every evening. And so getting supper ready was pretty simple and pretty quick. Just involved boiling a pot of water and then adding it to my food and kind of mixing it and letting it sit there for a minute in this sort of cozy that I made from a mylar reflector. And after that, I had to keep the stove running for another 2 or 3 hours just to keep melting snow and ice for the next day's use. And then that would be poured into a thermos. And for the next 24 hours, that would be my water. But it was while I was waiting for that snow and ice to melt that I would scribble in my journal and pretty detailed accounts of the preceding 24 hours. And then, of course, that material all became very useful to me when I sat down to write the book. Now, at this point, we have crossed into Saskatchewan. It's February, the days are getting longer. But still pretty cold, so it sparkled. But this combination of bright sun and cold made for really lovely skiing. And I remember a string of, I don't know, 5 or 6 days in Western Saskatchewan that were just kind of as close to paradise on skis as I've ever come. This is a picture, since I can't be there in person, of my skis. They were made by a relatively small Norwegian company called Homesickness that specializes in skis for long tours like this. And my model, they were named after Roald Amundsen, another great Norwegian explorer, the first person to reach the South Pole. And they had this picture of Amundsen emblazoned onto the skis themselves. And it's a picture taken when he was older. And he's got this very stern look on his face. And so whenever I felt kind of tired or discouraged, it was enough just to lock eyes with Roald Amundsen, and that would give me the push that I needed. This is the home of a character in the book who's got an entire chapter dedicated to him. And in the book, I call him the Kossack. His real name is Don, but his friends called him the Kossack. He was of Russian and Ukrainian ancestry. And he was this crusty northern character, a bachelor, dog musher, and a highly entertaining person. And so there's a whole chapter about him in the book. I'm tempted to read a bit about Don, but I'm not going to this evening. So this is the inside of his cabin. It was pretty basic. He had running water, but just one tap in the bathroom, and he jealously guarded his water supply by kind of putting buckets under all the drains and keeping the traps open and recycling the water. And then he would use that water to flush his toilets and so forth. So that was the Kossack. Now, it was in Saskatchewan that I really started skiing on lakes in earnest, lake after lake after lake. And this picture was taken actually after a pretty harrowing moment that I had out in the middle of a mid-sized lake when a storm intensified rather suddenly. And it was kind of, it was a whiteout, a full-blown whiteout with 10 or 15 feet of visibility. And I became completely disoriented, and then got stuck in sort of this slush mire in the middle of the lake as well. So it was a very scary moment, which I describe in great detail in the book. But anyway, I eventually obviously got out of that situation. And this picture was taken at the end of that day. And I was approaching a town called La Ronge in Saskatchewan, and I had a contact there who was holding a supply drop for me, and he skied out a few miles to meet me. And this was the moment that we met. And I had never been so happy to see another human being. This is on Lac La Ronge, which was the largest lake I skied across over the course of the winter, and it's one of the largest lakes. I think the 5th largest lake in Saskatchewan. And where I crossed it, it was between 30 and 40 miles wide. And so I had to spend 2 nights out on the lake. Now this picture is here really to give people a sense of scale, which maybe in northern Minnesota you don't need. But the black line on the horizon is an island, not the mainland. And so here's one of my camps on one of the 2 nights out on the lake. And you can see that there's no land on the horizon. And I think I want to read one more passage. This one will be shorter. Just a little bit about what it's like to ski on a big lake like this. There's an unmooring from time and space that comes with traveling over wide, monotonous expanses. I spent 2 nights and parts of 3 days on Lac La Ronge, and have few localizable memories of it. I only know the numbers because I wrote them in my diary. A thin black thread of land on the southern horizon and the sun rolling overhead kept me generally oriented without demanding that I think about it. And for the rest, I just leaned into the direction of dawn for 10 uninterrupted hours at a time. The world I could see consisted of exactly 2 elements that kissed each other in a perfect seam along a horizontal line, blue sky and white snow. There were 2 tent sites, but in memory, they've merged into one, the terminus of a straight line from the west I'd left behind me. Looking back, I could see the line retreat toward a golden horizon, but vanish into the flatness long before it got there. Near the end of the 2nd day, not far from the southern end of Long Island, I bent away from my eastward line to head south through loose snow towards Nipikimu Bay. The diary reports that progress slowed in the absence of a hard snowpack. I made camp earlier than I had the night before to avoid the bite of the twilight wind. So that's just a taste of skiing on a large lake. And here, finally, I am in Manitoba. This picture was taken by a newspaper reporter from a little town called Flin Flon in northern Manitoba, which I was just leaving. Flin Flon is a mining town, and so you can see the smelter in the background. And then this next picture is from that same series, just a little farther on. And so here I was heading into the final couple of weeks of the winter. It was early March at this point. And soon I would wind down my journey. Now, there are a couple of loose ends I want to tie up before we go to questions. So I mentioned that this story of my marriage that looked like it was going to be falling apart was goes in parallel with the story of the journey itself. But it's a story that went well beyond the end of the journey. And I talk about it in some detail in the book, which I'm not going to do now just because we don't have time. But I guess the short version is that the book ultimately has a happy ending, you might say, because eventually my wife and I, after a very long separation, eventually managed to work out our differences. And obviously my wife is a very forgiving person, because this book, I mean, I like to be honest about it. There are a lot of things that I did over the course of the winter, apart from the adventure, which is inspiring to people and whatnot. It was a very, in some ways, a very selfish undertaking. And I've tried to be honest about that in the book. But anyway, I won't go into that now, but the happy ending is that my wife and I eventually got back together. And one final thing I want to say, going back to the beginning of my talk, I talked about the ski racer, the Austrian ski racer, Tony Matt. And I told the story of him winning the race and then running over his skis and never skiing again. And when I decided I wanted to use that story to frame my story, I thought that I should look into the details just to make sure I had them straight. And so I read a few accounts of Tony Matt's descent of Mount Washington, but none of them mentioned this ending of, him running over his skis and whatnot. Just they said that he broke the record, made this crazy descent and so forth. So eventually I decided I would write to a ski historian at the New England Ski History Museum, who it turned out knew a great deal about Tony Matt. And he told me no, that definitely had not happened at the end of the race. He hadn't run over his skis, and he went on to have a long and illustrious skiing career. And so basically what that meant was that my father had just kind of improvised this ending, made his own more dramatic ending to the story. But there was something, it seemed, like I said, it contained this kernel of truth that sometimes we can take things too far, even things that, might be good things. And so I decided to tell that story. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And if anyone has any questions or comments, I would love to hear them and do my best to answer them.
We'll start with those of us who are in person.
Corinne, you got questions, or you got a chance to talk to the young man already, yes?
Yeah, but I was just offering, do you have a question first?
I would like to hear what other people have to say.
Okay.
Or think, or
Okay, and well, I do have a few to start. One of our book club members
Yes.
asked, did the journey change your idea of marriage? And if so, how?
Oh, wow, that's
We started with the hardest one. Let me go back to a more simple one. Okay, let's start with the simple one. Okay.
No, that's okay.
Go ahead. Okay.
I'll give it a shot. Yeah, it certainly changed my idea of marriage. But to articulate how, I'm tempted to say read the last chapter of the book. No,
I think this person did. So
no, I don't. I think it's more Alec. No, I think what it showed, well, in the case of my particular marriage, it showed me that it was worth. So my problem basically was that it had taken some doing in the early years of my relationship with my wife to persuade my wife that to be with me, basically. And I'd had, for a few years, I kind of had a one-track mind, and it was as though I would kind of excluded everything else just to focus on that one thing. And once I'd achieved that goal, all these other things kind of came back and started to call out for my attention. And one of them was this closeness to the natural world, I guess you might say, to speak generally, which was often lacking in my life in Italy. And so what I realized that was that you should never ignore parts of yourself, I guess. And so somehow I had to adjust my understanding of marriage to accommodate that realization. And what that means now is that I live primarily in New Hampshire, where I come from, a place that I love. And then I spend several months a year in Italy, and my wife continues to live in Italy. And she teaches, so she has summers off, she comes over. And so now we spend about half our time together, and it actually works quite well. Now, saying that, I understand that we both have very unique personalities. A lot of people wouldn't tolerate that kind of thing. But that's just one thing. Now I'll leave it at that, because otherwise I can drone on for hours about this.
I'm reading from the chat. Start. Okay, I have a bad habit. This comes from Phil. I have a bad habit of packing for my fears. Did you regret taking out too much food and equipment at the start?
I mean, I guess probably at the time, but these are not regrets that I still think about. Like, as I was sending things home and thinking about, why am I paying the post office to send this home when I shouldn't have bought it in the first place? Little things like that. But I guess that I had a chance to get rid of a lot of stuff before actually hitting the trail on my skis. And I guess it was that week of walking from between Prince Rupert and Terrace, that was kind of like a test run in some ways. That gave me a chance to think a bit about what I was carrying. And so I was fortunate, I guess, in that way.
Can you see his questions? He has more. Would you like to complete skiing?
Yes. Okay. Would you like to complete skiing across Canada? Have you started talking? I did actually think so it was while we were still apart for those 5 years. Was it the year after? I think it was actually I think it was two years after. I did go through a brief period of thinking about not skiing all the way across the rest of Canada, but about skiing from near where I left off, or from Flin Flon, somewhere in northern Manitoba, across the rest of the province to Hudson Bay, which would have taken probably another 3 weeks or a month. But of course, once you get to Hudson Bay, polar bears become a concern. And the more I read about polar bears and people who'd done things like this in polar bear country, the less I felt like I was wanted to, and so I decided against it. I love your thermos trick and the story of skis. When you're pulling the heavy sled, did you find the classic parallel ski stride to be easier on your knees, or did you need to skate to pull the load along? No, it was all classic, and I kept those shorter skins on the entire winter, because I wasn't able to pull with just wax, because it was a pretty heavy load. There were a few moments where I got a few kicks in of skating, but it was like a completely graceless kind of skating, and it was exhausting. But most of the time, I was in deepish snow, so it wasn't really feasible. I saw snowshoes in your original kit. Did you need to bring them out to manage deeper powder, or were the skis enough? good eye. That was the plan. That was why I had brought them with me. But after that first week, when I decided to purge, the snowshoes went. But then there were times later in the winter in Saskatchewan, in particular, there was kind of a spell of deep snow. And I would have loved to have my snowshoes with me, but unfortunately they were gone by that point, or even wider skis. How did you manage to navigate wide open spaces and to find the next town accurately? Did the night sky and the off in the distance glow help? So I mean, there was not much very sophisticated navigation. Most of the time I was in the forest following some kind of a trail. And then on lakes, yeah, I mean, I had maps. Most of the lakes were smallish and I could see the other side of the lake, but I did occasionally have to use my compass. And so I just, would shoot a bearing and follow it, as long as I had something to see, which once was not the case, and the consequences were unpleasant. The night sky and the off in the distance glow help. Not really. The kinds of towns in that part of the world don't give a lot of off in the distance glow until you're a few hundred yards away. So that didn't really help. The night sky, I guess, helped in a general kind of way if I needed it to. I mean, most of the time, like I said, I would see things in the night sky and see, oh yes, that must mean I'm heading, the moon just rose, I must be heading due east. But again, mostly I was on trails. So I imagine you were pretty tired each night. How were the dark skis, and did you enjoy the Northern Lights? Yes. So this person has obviously, is this still Phil? Yes, it is.
It's still Phil, yes.
So he's obviously read the book. Yes, I skied a lot at night, which was not my plan originally. But of course, especially in December and January, the days are relatively short, like 7 hours or so of daylight. And so if I had only skied during the day, that would have meant 16 hours, 17 hours in my tent, which would have been very dull. I can't sleep that much, of course. And so I did a lot of skiing at night. And he asked if they were tiring. Let's put it this way. I often skied quite relatively late into the night, because the prospect of making camp seemed like it seemed more tiring than just skiing on. And so it's kind of just a form of procrastination often. But eventually I would get tired and I would have to make camp and stop.
I was surprised how few times, I think you said you saw the Northern Lights once or something, or was it more than that?
Once, but it was
And you didn't.
it was before I even hit the trail. It was while I was driving west. Yeah.
Because here we try to see them, but often they're not not the dancing green lights. There's more of just the white. And then when you take a picture, you can see them. But
yeah, there was a good geomagnetic storm, like in maybe early December or late November. I can't remember when it was, but we had kind of cloudy nights, so there was no chance. I didn't see them anyway.
I had a question about gear. What did you use for a water filter? Did you simply boil it longer, or okay?
Yeah, I didn't have a filter.
Because filters would freeze. I mean, the ones I've seen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, it was just snow. So it wasn't, coming out of a stream or anything most of the time. Melted snow, and then I would boil it and then, pour it into my thermos.
Did you have to boil it for a certain length of time? Or not necessarily?
There are different school. There are people who say boil it for X number of minutes, but I think once it boils, I mean, probably if it's, I don't know. I think melted snow, it probably doesn't even really need to be boiled unless it's somehow been contaminated.
Oh, right, yes.
with some
Different
help.
from like the river or something.
But I boiled it because I wanted hot water. So my thermos would amazingly would keep it hot for like 36 hours or more. And of course, I'd like to drink hot water when I'm in the cold. It it helps keep me warm.
Mhm. Are you ready for questions?
I have something. You mentioned in your story that there was the thought of consequences later on in life from what you decided to do.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, does this become a reality, or have you like the knee or you mentioned the tendonitis or something? Have you had to suffer because of your abuse that you succumbed, that you?
Yeah, good question. So 9 years now have passed. Not really. I mean, so there are two very subtle things. One, my knee doesn't give me trouble, but if I sit, and maybe this is just normal aging, but if I sit still all day, don't go for a walk or something at any point in the day, that knee will start to get sore and stiff. So it needs to be used somehow a little bit each day. And then the other,
read that, excuse me, sorry, but actually, if you make a tight leg muscle, it promotes the fluid movement in the knee. So if you're going to be sitting for a movie or
Yeah.
something like that, and you just simply make a muscle, it promotes the release of the fluid to help your knee feel better. It's a physiological thing.
yeah, I'm gonna give that a try next time.
If you get stiff, just make a muscle. I find it works because I abuse myself with running
Yeah,
and weightlifting. And so this is just a trick. Just thought I would share.
no, I appreciate it. Thanks.
So really no consequence of it yet.
Sorry, the other thing is this pinky, only this one, it kind of has this little click. I can't control it as well as I can my other fingers. And every now and then it kind of does a little clicking thing. And that
Is
starts,
frostbite, or is that just the
so I
gripping
think
of
it's
the knees?
gripping the poles in the cold, all that, like day after day after day.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Did your hands get cold gripping the poles? Because I struggle with that here. Like I have
No,
really nice gloves, or mittens rather. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there were a few, I described it, there were a few times like breaking camp in the morning that my hands were very cold. And then kind of when I got started, they would be cold to start, but I expected, to have more problems with my toes and my fingers. But I didn't really. Once I got going, I skied really hard kind of skied hard all day. And that really kept me warm. So I never, this is a fact that amazes a lot of people, but over the course of the whole winter, I never wore more than a pair of sock liners on my feet. I mean, under my boots, of course. And my feet were never cold. And then gloves, I had a relatively thin pair of gloves.
You mentioned Canadian Tire. That's just a regular old, you're not going to get the high tech $100, $200 gloves at Canadian Tire.
No,
You're wearing like normal mittens, like little mittens.
they're just really basic. And that was enough. I mean, I had some thick, like outdoor research mittens that kind of were spares for in case it got really cold, but I never had to use them. They just
That's
stayed.
amazing.
Yeah.
So it was all about the movement.
Mm.
How about, I see a couple more questions from Phil. How about the skin on your heels from so much movement? No, nothing. I mean, a little bit of blistering at the beginning of the journey. I think more towards the ball of my foot than my heels, but no, nothing. And how did you manage your sweat? Yeah, but I did. Well, I guess that's another question. I had sort of a foot moisturizer, or whatever it's called, foot cream that I would put on my feet at night to keep them from cracking and whatnot. How did you manage your sweaty clothes in the winter? That's a good question, and I was very disciplined about not sweating, which is not easy to do, and that took some practice. But really there was only one time, I think, that I sweat profusely, at least. And I described it, I was trying to get to a motel in this town of Saskatchewan, and there was this blizzard coming in, and I was just getting in more and more intense, and I absolutely wanted to get to this place, so I just skied as hard as I possibly could and sweat. But other than that, I kind of found the sweet spot between skiing like quite hard and between skiing quite hard and too hard, I guess, if too hard means sweating. And what that often meant was wearing fewer clothes than was comfortable to kind of keep myself a little bit cool. But I mean, I absolutely did not. I wanted to keep moisture in my tent to an absolute minimum. So that meant not wanting to have wet clothes in my tent. And so that's the answer. It's hard to believe, but there was the guy who made my sleeping bag, who unfortunately has since died. His name was Jack Stevenson. He was kind of a cult figure and among cold weather explorers. And he made these sleeping bags called Stevenson's Warm Light, and then a tent as well. And really, those were his two products. And he was sort of this cottage. It was sort of a cottage industry, just run from his home, which happened to be in New Hampshire. And he's kind of a crackpot, but he had this website, and he just had all these basically sort of essays, diatribes really, about thermoregulation, various facets of regulating one's temperature. And so I mean, I knew that the guy was kind of nutty, but he had a lot of good ideas. And so I just kind of immersed myself in his website, and tried to sort of train myself psychologically, and convince myself that I could never sweat, and it paid off. That was kind of a long answer, sorry.
When you just said sock liners, sir, so you wore no sock on your boot, you just wore a liner and that was it?
Yes.
Understood, because, okay, that makes sense. So that was maybe where some of your heat was escaping.
Yes.
And that was probably a good thing.
That was the motivation. I didn't want my feet to get too hot to sweat.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Have you read Calvin Rotstrom, Paradise Below Zero? Absolutely. I think I mentioned it actually in there's a chapter called Paradise Below Zero in the book, which is a head nod to Calvin Rotstrom. It's a classic, as are some of his other books.
How much do you ski nowadays?
A lot. When I'm at home, I would say almost every day I go out for at least a little, a half an hour jaunt in the woods in the winter time, of course. If there's enough snow, which is most where I live, most of the time. Yeah.
If there was one, if you could pick one modern convenience that you really missed, what was it?
By the end of the journey, a bed. No, even though I had really thought highly of beds. Like I don't mind sleeping on the floor, but one thing I started to think the last few weeks of the journey was I can't wait to have a choice as to whether I'll sleep in a bed or on the ground.
That reminds me, in the book he mentioned about the tent. He preferred to sleep in the tent. So do you still sleep in tents regularly now after that experience?
I do, but in the summertime.
Yeah.
I haven't slept.
Are you serious?
I haven't spent a night out in the winter since 2013.
You have not. Well, that would not be the.
I haven't given away my winter sleeping bag. I haven't absolutely given up on the possibility that I might return to doing it again, but
yeah,
for the time being,
a lot of time in
but I still I still do a lot of long ski tours, but they just always end in my at home.
Yeah.
I think Phil had another question or something.
He said it was a thank you note.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, I just seen you showed your gear in that Vancouver unfinished cabin, and that weighs 100 pounds. Them items in that room, because you said, I think you're
Yeah.
towing 100 pounds.
Yeah, the total is 100. It was probably, I would guess 100 probably at the lightest. And then when I had a food drop, the
Okay.
weight of the food drop added to that.
That's a lot.
That's a
Yeah.
lot. That's a
Yeah.
bit to add to your. Yeah.
It is a lot, but it's much easier than carrying 100 pounds in a backpack.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's the thing about it is it's kind of it's getting up to speed. That's where most of the work is, and then once you get sliding along, you don't really. I mean, you barely notice the thing being pulled along behind you.
I don't know, when they analyzed what are these animals of the north, the sled dogs, like their heart rates and their health and they're like an athlete. If
Yeah.
if you know what I mean, the dog.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And I think of you, I mean, for you to subject yourself to that daily, the physical health and plus the intestinal fortitude had to have been there to even go
Yeah.
on.
By the end of the winter, I was just like sinewy, pure muscle, So, yeah, I mean, but I guess my point when I say it's easy, I don't mean it's like you're not working, but it's just kind of, I don't know, you kind of cruise, I guess the sled kind of becomes just part of the flow of things.
Yeah.
You don't feel like this weight kind of jerking around behind you. It's as if the sled has just become part of the bulk of your body, something like.
It's almost like it has wheels.
Yeah.
One of the first books we read in this book club was Grandma Gatewood's Great Walk. Have you heard of it?
I've heard of it, but I haven't
I mean,
read it.
Read it, sir.
I mean, some of us thought 2 hours of the
Appalachian Trail
were
book.
enough. What?
This is
Grandma Gatewood's Walk.
right? Was it on the Appalachian Trail?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, was she the first woman to through hike or?
Twice.
And then she did it again, and she was really old. I
And
mean,
you were
or older.
mentioning
Just-
30s, yeah, you were mentioning 30s, like
I
people
shouldn't
need
say
to
real,
do
she
this
was, how
now.
old was
This
she?
lady did it when she was like 60, 50 some odd, 60, and then she did it twice.
In tennis shoes.
In tennis shoes, dude.
Like with no gear, but what was interesting, it's a fascinating story. I mean, the book is
It's a
fine.
great book.
Yeah,
Sure.
fascinating story. What was interesting, I thought, is she was also inspired by National Geographic.
Yep.
So when you said that in your book, I was like, wow, that's two
There you go.
big adventures
More.
inspired by National Geographic. And she just like had a really hard life. And so it was towards the end of her life after she'd raised her kids, and she just started walking after she was done with her responsibility. So, and Phil's telling you more. And her gear, I mean, we all thought that, well, most of us thought, I guess I don't want to speak for everyone, that she should have put a little more effort into preparing. So yeah, just like like she made her own denim bag with or was it
A pillow,
Bill
saying a pillowcase over her
pillowcase
shoulder.
bag? Yeah. And
And she's
then unlike you, one thing I appreciated about your journey, which I mean, it sounded like you had a bit of conflict about it, was that you were willing to say, I don't have to be on skis every mile. Like if the weather was bad, if the ice was slushy, like you could adapt. And I think that was also important for safety. But Grandma Gatewood, she refused. She was going to do every mile. And so, if someone helped her, then she would go back to the mile she started. So, I mean,
Well,
my style is more like yours, like, hey, I got a ride. I think I'm going to pick up later or whatever.
yeah, well, that in a case like that, the trail is the thing. But for me, I had
wasn't a trail.
thought of the idea was I just like this idea of spending the whole winter, and going through this place and learning something about the place and kind of the culture of winter. But then, like along the development, I started to focus more on the skiing, and it was almost as though I'd forgotten that wasn't really, skiing was just, to me, it seemed like the most sensible way of moving through a winter landscape. But then once I was out there, I thought, well, I'm still out moving across this winter landscape and learning about this place and meeting people. So if I don't ski every bit of the way, it's not that important. Although when I first, the first time I took a ride from someone, I was like, no, what have I done? My record, but I got past that pretty quickly. But it's still, I can understand, if someone's hiking the Appalachian Trail, wanting to hike every bit of the way. And some people are really serious about this. I met, this couple I stayed with, Dave and Crystal in northern Saskatchewan, were really serious canoeists. And so they would and they lived along the Churchill River system, which is an important chain of lakes that people use who are paddling across Canada. And they told me the story of a couple that had this really regimented way of paddling. They would paddle, the man and wife would have their own side for X number of strokes, and they would count them out, all the exact number, let's say 200 strokes, and then they would switch 200 strokes on this side. All the way across Canada, they went like that, counting. They would count out loud so they know they went. And I thought, what kind of a way is that to, you wouldn't notice anything. But anyway, this couple, and I think they were from the UK, they, for some reason, I think one of them got sick or something like that, and they had to skip a section of I don't remember what it was, let's say 60 miles. And so they felt like they'd failed or something. And so the next year they flew back all the way back to Canada and went to the exact spot where they'd started and skied, paddled the exact, and nothing more, nothing less, just the exact 60 mile. It was putting a patch onto their journey. So people can be funny that way, I think.
Yeah.
But different strokes for different folks.
Do you have a website? I'm not sure. I did the audio book from Audible, and I don't know if there was a website in your paperback or anything like that.
I do not have a website. No.
You do not. So if someone wanted to talk to you again, it would be impossible, probably. Or
I can give people my email address. You can contact my publisher, and they will write to me and let me know someone's trying to get in touch with me. Or I'm on Facebook as well.
I don't do Facebook. Sorry.
So are you writing?
I don't like to do Facebook. But if you need to get a hold of me, I think you'll manage somehow. I'm not a hard person to reach.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So are you writing another book?
That's a good question.
I am writing another book. Yeah. It's not an easy book to describe in a couple of sentences, but the simple thing. So yeah, I think of it as a kind of a personal geography of New England. So it's not a travel book in the way that this one is. It doesn't describe a specific journey, although there's lots of movement around it. And so the basic premise is, I grew up in eastern New England, New Hampshire mostly, but my father's family is Canadian, and they're from Kingston, Ontario, which is a town in the St. Lawrence Valley. So, in terms of the whole continent, they're 250 miles apart, these two places. But I've always felt very close to both of them. We spent a lot of time, especially in the summers, on this island in the St. Lawrence. And so they were kind of two poles of home. And one day, years ago, even before I made the ski journey, while I was living in Italy, I noticed that when I did feel homesick, it was sort of this vague feeling of being drawn to one of these two places, and also kind of to the expanse between them. And so I started thinking of home as kind of like a range, like an animal has a range or a territory, rather than as a point on the map. And basically, this book is going to be an exploration of that idea. And I'm going to tell the story, whatever the story there is to tell, by recounting various shorter journeys I've made through that space, and then also by digging into literature and art as well, and hopefully come up with some kind of a cohesive whole.
That sounds great.
We'll
Yeah.
see. It's a much harder book to write. I'm
Yeah, like
fine.
one man said in a review, I read a review on Audible of a person that reviewed your story, and they said it was like you narrated like how did they word it? Something like they were there. So you did a good job is what they were saying.
I'm glad to hear that.
You know, someone, and I think you did a good job with the story too, but they were saying it's almost like I took the journey with you or something. That's how they worded it.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed the parts about how people live up there. You know, that was part of your goal, like when you would stay with people and the way you described their homes and how they survived winter. I found that fascinating. So I'm always very curious how other people live in their day-to-day lives. So,
I see another question from Phil. Any big adventures planned? Not this big. I would like to, another journey I'd like to make and then somehow write about. I would like to go on a walk that's taken only just between the hours of sunset and sunrise, just walk at night for like maybe a month, kind of make myself nocturnal, and then write. But the book would be, well, kind of like this, but I would like to write more about night itself and kind of what night means in our culture, and, you know, the loss of dark skies and all kinds of things like that. And then just use the journey as kind of a thread. And this kind of experiment with making myself nocturnal as a way of getting insights into night. And when I said that to one crowd, someone asked the same question, and someone said, "So you just like to take journeys when you're guaranteed that you're not going to see anyone else out there?" Which was not the purpose.
fascinating.
I don't know.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I don't know if
You're very welcome. Thank you, and thanks for all your questions. This is great. I feel like with the camera on the room, I feel almost like I'm in the room with you.
but I'm glad this worked out as it is.
So am I.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking to us, and we wish you
for writing
well.
the book.
Thank
And for
you.
writing the book. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.